At 18, Alara had thought her life was her own. She had imagined a quiet village, the smell of bread from the baker's oven, and the soft laughter of her friends in the evenings. But that life had ended the moment her father's debts had reached the hands of the Alpha King, Kalen. The king was a figure of nightmares and legends, a man whose name alone could silence a room, whose scars told stories of battles no one dared to witness. And now, she was to be his bride. The carriage that took her from her father's home to the palace felt like a coffin on wheels. The streets blurred into one another as the landscape became darker, the forests denser. Even the sun seemed unwilling to shine fully, as if the world knew of the sorrow waiting for her. She pressed her hands together, feeling her nails bite into her palms, and whispered a small prayer she had long thought forgotten. Upon arrival, the castle loomed like a sentinel of stone and shadow. Its spires touched the clouds, its walls hid countless secrets, and its gates opened as though expecting her, welcoming her into a life she could not refuse. Servants bowed as she entered, their eyes wary, not with disrespect but with the quiet understanding that the young girl entering these halls was now part of a world she could never escape. Kalen did not meet her at the gates. Instead, his presence was felt before it was seen. A chill brushed against her spine, not from the cold stone but from the aura surrounding him. He was a king forged in war, his power visible in the way the soldiers straightened their posture as he passed, in the way the shadows seemed to cling closer to him. When she finally saw him, it was in the grand hall, seated on a throne of black iron and silver. His face, half hidden by a scar that ran from his brow down his cheek, was a map of pain and authority. And yet, his eyes piercing, gray, almost storm-like, held something she could not name. "Welcome, Alara." His voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of the kingdom itself. "I hope you understand the nature of your stay." Her knees nearly buckled. I understand, Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling but not breaking. She would need every ounce of courage she had to survive here. "Good. Then let us proceed," he said, rising. His stature was immense, the kind of height and strength that could crush rebellion and fear alike. He led her down dark corridors lined with suits of armor and tapestries depicting wars and victories. Every step she took seemed to echo, not just against the walls, but inside her chest. Each beat reminding her that this was her new life, and there was no turning back. Kalen spoke little, his gaze often on her but never soft. His silence was not cruel, it was a weapon, a test, a barrier. Alara felt herself shrink under it, and yet, a strange pull made her step closer rather than away. She had always been stubborn, and even in fear, she could not help but observe him, the way his hands rested lightly on the arms of the throne, the subtle way his eyes scanned the hall, calculating, always watching. That night, in the bridal chamber, Alara lay awake on a bed too large, beneath blankets too heavy, in a room too cold. The walls whispered of kings long gone, of wars won and lost, and she could feel the pulse of the castle as if it had a life of its own. She did not sleep, not because of fear alone, but because of the sense that this marriage was bigger than her, bigger than Kalen, and bigger than any debt. It was tied to shadows, to curses whispered about in the market streets and noble halls alike. Days passed in a blur of lessons and observations. She learned the rules quickly. Never interrupt, never question in public, and always maintain a posture that suggested loyalty without weakness. Kalen's scrutiny was constant, and she began to notice the small details. A flicker of softness when he thought no one watched, a hand brushing against a scar he never mentioned, a momentary hesitation before issuing orders. But even as she learned, the kingdom stirred. Rumors of rebellion reached her ears, whispers that Kalen's bloodline carried an old curse, a shadow that would destroy him if the right conditions aligned. Alara could not fully understand it, but she felt the chill of it, the way servants spoke in hurried tones, and eyes darted nervously to the throne. She realized, with a pang, that her presence here was not just as a bride to repay a debt. She might be part of something far larger, something that could change the fate of the king and the kingdom itself. One evening, while walking through the castle gardens, she felt the first brush of connection, fragile and frightening. Kalen appeared at the archway, tall as the night itself, his cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. She expected him to command her, to dismiss her presence as usual. Instead, he spoke softly, almost cautiously. "The roses here," he said, nodding toward a row of dark blooms, "were planted by my mother." Ilara's heart caught. "They are beautiful," she whispered. "Even in shadow, they grow." Kalen's eyes lingered on her longer than usual. Yes, even in shadow. There was something unspoken between them, a flicker of understanding that she could not name. She did not speak further, for fear that words would shatter the fragile tension that had formed. That night, the castle shook. A messenger arrived, bloodied and trembling, bearing a scroll sealed with the king's emblem. Kalen's hand, strong and sure, broke the seal, and his eyes darkened as he read. Ilara, drawn by instinct and fear, watched him closely. "It seems," he said finally, voice low and tight, "the curse stirs sooner than expected." "Curse?" Ilara asked, her voice barely audible. Kalen did not answer directly. He merely turned his gaze toward her, and she felt the weight of it pressing into her chest. There was danger in those eyes, danger for the kingdom, for the man, and she realized danger for herself. As she returned to her room, sleep was impossible. She could feel the castle itself alive around her, the rustle of tapestries, the creak of old beams, the faint whisper of a wind that seemed to carry voices. She pressed her hands over her heart, knowing that her life had changed irreversibly. She was not just a bride to repay a debt, she was part of a story she could not yet understand, tied to a man whose pain was as vast as the kingdom he ruled. And that was when she understood. Her marriage was not just political. It was bound to fate, to a curse, and perhaps to a love she could not yet imagine. Outside, the night deepened, and in the distance, the wind carried the faint sound of whispers, like a warning from the past. Ilara shivered, yet a strange determination took root. She would survive this marriage, this castle, this man. And perhaps, in the process, she might find the courage to touch the shadow that even the Alpha King feared. The next morning, Kalen appeared at her door, his presence as commanding as ever. He held a small, intricately carved box in his hand. Inside was a key not just to a door, but to a room he had never shown anyone. "This," he said, voice low, "may answer questions you do not yet dare to ask, or it may make your fear grow." Ilara accepted the key with trembling hands. Something about it felt heavier than iron, heavier than duty. She realized that entering the room was a choice that would bring her closer to Kalen, closer to the curse, and closer to a destiny she could neither run from nor fully understand. And so, at 18, Ilara stepped further into the shadows of the castle, not knowing if she would emerge with her heart unbroken, or if the darkness would claim more than just her freedom. The doors of the unknown loomed before her, and with each step, the weight of destiny pressed harder. The whisper of a curse, the storm of secrets, and the enigma of the scarred Alpha King all awaited her. Somewhere in that darkness, a choice awaited one that could bind her life to Kalen's, for better or worse. The first night of her marriage ended not with warmth or safety, but with the echo of uncertainty and a question that burned brighter than fear. Would she survive the king she was meant to serve, and perhaps the king she might come to love? The morning after receiving the key, Elara could barely eat breakfast. The castle's corridors, which had seemed imposing before, now felt alive with secrets. Every shadow seemed to hide more than stone and dust. Whispers of the past, echoes of the curse, and the presence of the king himself. Kaelin watched her from a distance, always silent, always observing. It was as if he could see her fear, her hesitation, and perhaps even the faint spark of curiosity she had not yet admitted to herself. The key burned in her palm as she held it, the intricate carvings pressing into her skin like a puzzle she could not yet solve. She knew instinctively that it was not a simple key. It was a test, a challenge, a step into a world that few dared enter. And yet, she could not resist. Her curiosity, mingled with courage she did not know she possessed, pushed her forward. She wandered the castle until she found the door it fit. It was hidden behind a tapestry, depicting a long-forgotten battle, the figures in the embroidery frozen mid-struggle. When she inserted the key, it turned with a reluctant click, and the door creaked open to reveal a spiral staircase leading downward. The air was colder here, heavier, filled with a faint scent of old parchment and candle smoke. Elara descended slowly, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the silent hall. At the bottom, she found a chamber unlike any she had imagined. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, scrolls, and strange artifacts. Candles burned without smoke, illuminating a small, circular room at the center. A desk held papers covered in handwriting she could not read, maps with symbols she did not recognize, and a small, sealed envelope addressed simply, "To the one who dares to see." Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a note written in Kaelin's hand. "The past and the present are not separate. To understand me, you must understand the shadows I carry. Read carefully, learn wisely, and remember, curiosity can save or destroy." Elara felt a shiver. Here was a glimpse into the king's mind, into the man behind the scars. She began to explore the chamber, leafing through ancient tomes that spoke of kings, warriors, and magical curses. One scroll described a bloodline cursed to bear the weight of unending war, doomed to lose everything they loved unless they could find a bond of true loyalty and trust. A sudden noise made her start. Kaelin stood at the doorway, his cloak swaying slightly, eyes intense. "I see you have found my private chamber," he said. His voice carried no anger, only observation. "Few are brave enough to step inside." I did not mean to intrude, Your Majesty," Elara said quickly, closing the envelope. I wanted to understand." Kaelin stepped closer, and for the first time, his gaze softened, if only slightly. Understanding is dangerous, but necessary. Some truths are better known than feared. Elara swallowed. "And what truth should I fear the most?" Kaelin's eyes darkened. "The truth that the past is never gone. It lives in scars, in shadows, and sometimes in the hearts of those who seem untouchable." She looked at him, truly looking for the first time. The man before her was not just a king or a warrior. He was a human shaped by loss, by duty, and by a curse older than the kingdom itself. And in that moment, a strange empathy stirred within her, along with a flicker of something else, something forbidden and terrifying. Admiration, respect, and perhaps a trace of longing. Days passed in a rhythm that seemed both endless and fleeting. Elara attended lessons on courtly etiquette, the politics of clans, and the ways of magic that still lingered in Kaelin's kingdom. She observed him during meetings with his advisors, noting the precision of his mind, the cruelty tempered by fairness, and the flashes of doubt he hid behind stern words. She realized that the man who ruled with an iron fist was not devoid of heart. He was a prisoner of circumstance, just as she was. One afternoon, As Ilara walked through the gardens, she noticed Kalen sitting alone on a stone bench, a rare sight. The wind tugged at his dark cloak, and the sunlight glinted off the edges of his scars. He did not rise as she approached, only tilted his head slightly in acknowledgement. "The gardens are peaceful," she said cautiously. Kalen's lips curved faintly, a shadow of a smile. "Peace is rare," he said, "and fleeting, but it exists, if one knows where to look." Ilara hesitated, then sat on the bench beside him, careful to give him space. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It was filled with something unspoken, a connection neither of them fully understood. Finally, Kalen spoke. "Do you know why I have these scars?" Ilara shook her head. I know only that they are from battles, from pain you endured." "They are from battles, yes," he admitted, "but the worst battles are not fought with sword or shield. They are fought in trust, betrayed, in love lost, and in choices that leave nothing but regret. Every scar on my face is a reminder of a mistake, a loss I cannot undo." Her heart ached for him, though she barely knew him. Kalen looked at her, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers. "Regret is useless. I can only survive and learn. But perhaps someone might help me carry the burden, if they dare." Ilara felt the weight of his words. She had come to the palace as a bride to repay a debt. Yet here was the man who might be more prisoner than master, more haunted than cruel. And in that realization, a flicker of courage rose in her chest. She would not flee. She would not bend. She would face the shadows beside him, whether he wanted her there or not. Night came, bringing with it the first real threat. The castle's walls, usually silent, were pierced by the clamor of alarms. Ilara, unsure of what to do, hid behind a tapestry as armed figures moved through the halls. Kalen appeared as if from the shadows themselves, sword in hand, his movements fluid and terrifying in their precision. Ilara watched, heart pounding, as he fought, not merely with skill, but with a controlled rage that seemed almost supernatural. She had never seen a human move like this. His strength, his strategy, his ferocity, all revealed the man behind the legend. And yet, even as he defeated the intruders, she saw something else. A flash of concern for her, fleeting but undeniable. After the chaos ended, Kalen approached her. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his voice low and commanding, but with a note of worry she had never expected. Yes," she stammered. He studied her for a moment longer. "Good. You will need courage in this place, more than beauty or obedience. Courage, and perhaps loyalty that is not demanded, but freely given." The weight of his words settled on her. She had come to repay a debt, to survive, but survival alone would not be enough. To live here, in this castle, under the shadow of a king and a curse, she would need more. She would need to understand him, and perhaps, in time, help him understand her. That night, as she lay in her chamber, she could still hear the echoes of battle, the whispers of the walls, and the faintest stirrings of magic that seemed tied to Kalen himself. She realized, with a mix of fear and fascination, that her life had become entwined with his in ways she could not yet comprehend. The curse, the kingdom, the king, all were threads in a tapestry she had no choice but to walk through. Ilara clutched her blanket, thinking of the key, the secret chamber, and the man whose presence filled every corner of the castle. She did not sleep easily, but she did not close her eyes in fear either. Instead, she imagined a future where she could stand beside him, not as a frightened bride, but as someone who had earned a place in a life built on shadows, scars, and strength. Outside, the wind carried a faint whisper through the corridors. almost as if the castle itself spoke to her. The journey has begun. Trust is fragile, courage is tested, and hearts are the most dangerous of all. Ilara knew she had crossed a threshold. There would be challenges, betrayals, and perhaps even danger to her very life. But something deep inside her told her that turning back was impossible. She had stepped into Kaelin's world, a world of power, scars, and secrets. And somewhere in that darkness, a bond was beginning to form. A bond that could either save them both or destroy everything they held dear. The morning would bring new lessons, new trials, and new glimpses into the curse that threatened to undo the Alpha King. And Ilara, standing on the edge of fear and fascination, understood one thing clearly. She had already begun the journey that would change her life forever. Days in the castle grew heavier, as though the walls themselves remembered every betrayal, every battle, and every sorrow that had ever been whispered into them. Ilara felt the weight of this history pressing upon her chest with each step she took through the corridors. She had begun to understand that living here was not about survival alone. It was about learning the language of shadows, of silence, and of the king she now shared a bond with. Kaelin's presence was constant, a quiet force at the edge of her vision. He did not speak more than necessary, yet every gesture carried meaning. The way he paused before opening doors, the way he measured her responses, and the subtle way he adjusted the guards' positions all showed that he was always aware, always watching. Ilara, in turn, began to notice the details she had missed before. The faint trembling in his fingers when he thought no one watched. The lines of fatigue etched deeper into his face, and the moments when his eyes seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. One evening, as twilight painted the gardens in hues of violet and gold, Kaelin invited her to walk with him along the outer walls. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet stone and distant forests. The castle loomed behind them, vast and imposing, yet it was the quiet between them that drew Ilara's attention. "You have grown brave," Kaelin said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "Bravery is rare in those who are forced into service. Most bend or break. You stand." Ilara's heart fluttered. I have to. For my father, for myself, and for this place, I suppose." She did not finish the last thought. To speak openly about Kaelin or the king's needs felt like stepping too close to fire. Kaelin studied her, his expression unreadable. And yet, bravery is dangerous. It invites scrutiny, envy, and even death. "Are you willing to risk all for a world you barely understand?" She met his gaze, finding in it a storm of power and vulnerability intertwined. "If it is the only way to survive, yes." After one, "We?" asked. For the first time, Kaelin's lips curved into something resembling a smile, faint but real. It was not a gesture of kindness, but acknowledgement, a recognition of the courage she carried within her. That night, a whisper of movement stirred her from sleep. The corridors of the castle seemed alive, shifting, breathing. She rose, guided by instinct, and found herself in front of a tapestry she had not noticed before. The air shimmered slightly, as if the threads themselves held a secret. With careful hands, she drew it aside and discovered a narrow passage descending into darkness. At the bottom, the chamber was smaller than the last, but charged with an energy she could almost feel thrumming in her veins. A circle of runes glowed faintly on the floor, pulsing in rhythm with something deep and unseen. In the center, a mirror stood, its surface dark and fluid, reflecting not her image, but shadows that shifted with a life of their own. Kaelin's voice startled her. "You found it." He appeared from the shadows, calm yet intense. "Few are allowed here, and fewer still return without fear." "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where the curse speaks," he said, stepping closer. This mirror. It does not show the present. It shows what the heart fears, what the soul regrets, and sometimes, what the future might hold. It is not safe for the faint of heart. Ilara approached cautiously, her reflection merging with 1,000 possibilities. Faces she had never seen flickered in the glass. Some pleading, some angry, some sorrowful. And then, she saw Kalen, not as he was now, but as he could be. Broken, alone, consumed by shadows, she could almost feel reaching for him. I do not understand, she said, shivering. Kalen's hand brushed hers. A light, almost tentative touch. Understanding comes with courage. And courage comes with choice. You may step back, or you may see what most never dare. Ilara took a breath and stepped closer. The mirror shimmered, revealing flashes of Kalen's past. Battles that left him scarred, decisions that cost lives, and moments of isolation that no king should endure. She saw him as a young man, full of fire and determination, who had loved and lost in ways that had hardened him into the alpha king he had become. Tears pricked at her eyes. She realized, painfully, that the man before her throne was not just a ruler. He was a prisoner of fate, bound by a curse that had shaped every choice, every scar, and every triumph he had ever known. And she, in turn, had stepped into this world not merely as a bride to repay a debt, but as someone who might be the key to his freedom. Kalen's voice broke through her thoughts. You see the truth, Ilara, and now you must decide. Will you turn away, or will you stand with me? I will stand, she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. If you let me. He nodded, a mixture of relief and wariness in his eyes. Then understand this. Standing with me is not a choice of comfort. It is a choice of fire and shadow, of loyalty and risk. You will face truths most fear to know, and you may not survive unscathed. Ilara swallowed, feeling both fear and resolve. The castle seemed to respond, the shadows lengthening, the walls humming with energy. Somewhere, deep in the stone, the curse stirred, aware that another heart had joined the journey. The following days were filled with lessons more dangerous than etiquette or politics. Kalen allowed her to train alongside his warriors, teaching her to move with awareness, to anticipate danger, and to hold her own in a world ruled by strength. At first, she struggled, every muscle rebelling against the harshness of the exercises. But Kalen's presence was constant, not to coddle, but to push, to challenge, to shape her into someone who could survive beside him. Their interactions grew charged with tension. A glance too long, a hand brushing unintentionally against hers. Moments of proximity that neither dared acknowledge openly. Ilara felt emotions she could not name. Fear, respect, admiration, and a strange pull she did not yet understand. Kalen, in turn, seemed equally affected, though he masked it behind authority and control. One night, as they sparred in the training hall, the air itself seemed to thrum with energy. Ilara parried a strike and looked up into Kalen's eyes. There was something in them a storm barely held back, a vulnerability he had not shown to anyone else. Enough for tonight, he said, lowering his weapon. You are learning faster than I expected. But remember, strength is more than skill. It is understanding, patience, and the courage to face what you fear most. She nodded, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still coursing through her. I will remember. As she left the hall, a shadow moved outside the windows. Something unseen had watched the session, and Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. The castle was full of dangers, some human, some not. She had stepped into a world where every moment carried risk, and yet she could not turn back. The next morning brought a visitor she had not expected, a messenger, pale and trembling, carrying news of unrest beyond the kingdom's borders. Rival clans were moving, preparing for war, and some whispered that the curse had already begun to influence the fate of Kaelin's reign. Kaelin's reaction was measured but intense. "The storm comes sooner than I feared," he said, "and you, Elara, are now part of it. Your courage will be tested, your loyalty questioned. And the curse? It will demand more than either of us expected." Elara felt her stomach tighten. The castle no longer felt like a place of walls and stone. It felt like a living entity, aware of her every step, her every heartbeat, and her growing connection to Kaelin. That night, as she lay in her chamber, she thought of the mirror, the training, the whispers, and the danger that now surrounded them. Fear coiled in her chest, but alongside it, determination grew. She had chosen to stand with Kaelin, and now there was no turning back. Outside, the wind carried the faintest sound of whispers through the castle. The shadows seemed deeper, the night colder, and somewhere in the distance, a presence watched, waiting, aware that two hearts were now bound together by fate, by courage, and by the shadow of a curse that had been dormant for too long. Elara knew, deep within her, that the days ahead would not be easy. The curse was real. The kingdom was fragile, and Kaelin, despite his strength, carried a burden she could only begin to understand. But she also knew something else. She would not face it alone. And yet, as the candle flickered and the wind howled against the walls, she could not shake the feeling that something or someone was moving closer, waiting for the perfect moment to test them both. The night ended with the echo of footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber. Elara's heart beat fast. She could not see who it was, but she knew one thing for certain. The next challenge had begun, and it would demand everything she had to offer: courage, loyalty, and perhaps even the beginnings of trust and love. The kingdom had begun to stir with tension, though the sun still rose over the castle walls, as if unaware of the storm gathering beyond them. Elara had learned to move through the halls with a steady heart. Yet every shadow, every whisper of wind, reminded her that danger lurked not just outside, but within the very stones of the palace. Kaelin's presence was a constant, a force she could not ignore. He had begun to speak more freely with her, though his words were always careful, measured, and often carrying layers she could barely understand. It was during these moments that she realized the king's power was not only in his strength or his scars, but in his ability to command silence, to make the world bend to his attention without a word. One evening, he led her to a secluded tower overlooking the forest. The wind whipped her hair, and the fading light painted the land in shades of fire and shadow. Kaelin's face was stoic, but there was a weight in his eyes that drew her closer. "The kingdom is restless," he said. "Rival clans move, sensing weakness. And the curse, it grows stronger with every challenge, every threat. Soon, it may reach beyond me." Elara nodded, her mind racing. "And what will we do?" "We survive," he said simply. "We adapt, and we fight." The word fight carried a power that resonated through her chest. She knew that the battles ahead would not only test strength, but hearts, loyalty, and courage. And she also knew, painfully, that Kaelin's greatest struggle was not against the enemies who marched at the borders, but against the shadows he carried within himself. Days turned into nights, and the castle became a living lesson. Elara trained alongside Kaelin's warriors, learning the weight of a sword, the precision of defense, and the patience required to anticipate threats she could not yet see. Kaelin was always near, guiding, correcting, sometimes scolding, but never cruel. She felt the tension in the air each time they sparred, a mixture of authority, closeness, and a strange, unspoken challenge. One night, after a particularly grueling session, Kaelin led her to the courtyard. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the stone and shadows. He did not speak immediately, only observed her, his storm-gray eyes tracing her movements, her breathing, the way her shoulders held tension. "You are growing stronger," he said finally. "Stronger than I expected. But strength alone is not enough. Courage is only part of survival. Understanding is the rest. You must learn what binds me, what binds the kingdom, and perhaps, what binds us." Ilara's heart beat faster. Kalen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do not mistake survival for simplicity. Our lives, our choices, our fates, they are entwined in ways you cannot yet fully comprehend. And soon, you will see the truth." The next morning brought a messenger from the outer borders. Reports spoke of an army gathering, and whispers of dark magic awakening among the rival clans. Kalen's expression remained unreadable as he read the scroll, yet Ilara could see the tension coiling in his jaw, the tight grip on the parchment. "They underestimate me," he said finally. "And they underestimate you. That will be their mistake." Ilara looked at him, realizing for the first time that he truly believed in her, not merely as a bride or a companion, but as someone capable of standing beside him in the storm. It was a dangerous trust, one that carried both hope and fear. As the days passed, the castle's walls seemed to hum with anticipation. Ilara began to notice small signs of the curse's influence, shadows that lingered too long, whispers in corners when no one was present, and a chill that rose without wind. Kalen himself grew more restless, wandering the halls at night, speaking to the shadows as if they answered him. One evening, he led her to the chamber where the mirror of shadows awaited. Its surface was darker than before, more alive, reflecting not just images, but possibilities. Ilara stepped closer, heart pounding. "This mirror shows more than the past," Kalen said. "It shows what may come if we fail. And it shows what must be faced within." Ilara saw visions that made her stomach tighten, the castle burning, Kalen wounded, rival kings striking at the borders. But she also saw flashes of hope, herself standing beside him, courage shining even in darkness, and moments of connection that glimmered despite the shadows. "Do you see it?" Kalen asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "Do you understand what is at stake?" I think I do," she said, her voice trembling. "We are bound by more than duty, by something deeper, and the choices we make, they matter." Kalen studied her for a long moment. "Yes, and the choices you make now will shape not only my fate, but the kingdom's, and, perhaps, ours." The air in the chamber seemed to pulse, as if the shadows themselves were listening. Ilara felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something she could not yet name, a connection to the king that went beyond fear or respect. The following night brought the first true test. A messenger arrived with urgent news. A rival clan had breached the borders, their forces moving swiftly, and reports suggested the use of dark magic, the very same that had cursed Kalen's bloodline. The castle erupted into preparation, soldiers readying weapons, gates being secured, and the air thick with tension. Kalen moved like a shadow among his warriors, giving orders, checking defenses, and occasionally glancing at Ilara, ensuring she remained safe. She had learned to move with purpose, to anticipate danger, and to act with courage. And yet, even as she assisted, she could feel the weight of the curse pressing closer, a shadow that sought to test them both. The attack came under the cover of night. Figures moved silently along the castle walls, shadows flitting through the torchlight. Kalen met them with a force that was both terrifying and precise, his sword flashing, his voice commanding. Ilara followed, moving through the corridors, guiding soldiers, and holding her own in ways that surprised even her. Amid the chaos, she caught a glimpse of the supernatural influence of the curse. Shadows that moved with a mind of their own, whispering threats, trying to sow fear. Kaelin's eyes narrowed as he confronted them, and for the first time, Elara saw a hint of vulnerability beneath his strength. When the battle subsided, the castle walls intact but the danger far from over, Kaelin approached her. His expression was grave, his eyes stormy, yet there was a hint of something softer beneath the surface. "You faced fear tonight," he said. "You faced it and moved forward. That is more than courage. That is strength of heart. And strength of heart may be what saves us." Elara felt warmth in her chest, a mixture of relief and pride. She had begun to understand Kaelin, not just as a king, but as a man carrying burdens that would crush ordinary hearts. And she had begun to understand her own place in this world, not a pawn, not a servant, but a companion, a force in her own right. Yet even in that moment of connection, the shadows whispered. Somewhere in the castle, unseen, a presence observed them, waiting, measuring, knowing that the next challenge would come not from swords alone, but from the curse that had haunted Kaelin's bloodline for generations. That night, as Elara lay in her chamber, the echoes of battle still lingering in her mind, she thought of Kaelin. She thought of the mirror, the lessons, and the growing bond between them. The fear that had once paralyzed her was now tempered by understanding and courage. She knew that the days ahead would demand more of her, of him, and of the connection forming between them. And then she heard it, a faint, deliberate knock at her door. Her heart leapt. The castle was silent now, save for the wind. She approached cautiously, hand resting on the doorknob. When she opened it, no one was there, only a small envelope lying on the floor, sealed with a mark she did not recognize. Inside was a note, written in hurried, uneven script. "The curse awakens. The shadows move. Trust no one beyond the walls. The fate of the Alpha King is yours, to protect or destroy." Elara's breath caught. The warning was clear. Danger was far from over, and the bond she was beginning to form with Kaelin would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. Yet, in that same moment, she felt a spark of determination. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through, whatever the cost. Outside, the wind whispered through the castle, carrying the faintest sense of movement, of anticipation. The shadows had begun their next test, and Elara, standing at the edge of fear and courage, understood one thing with absolute clarity. The journey was far from over, and the bond between herself and the scarred Alpha King would either save them both or leave nothing behind. The night had fallen over the castle like a heavy cloak. Shadows moved along the stone walls, deeper and darker than ever before, as if the curse itself had awakened fully. Elara stood at the highest tower, the wind whipping her hair around her face, and felt the weight of what was to come. She had trained, learned, and endured. Yet the true test had not yet arrived. Tonight, the fate of the kingdom, the curse, and Kaelin himself would be decided. Kaelin appeared at her side without a sound, as though the shadows themselves guided him. His storm-gray eyes were intense, and for the first time, there was no mask of control, only raw determination and a hint of fear. He placed a hand on her shoulder, firm yet grounding. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Elara nodded, though her heart raced. "I am. Whatever comes, we face it together." Kaelin studied her for a long moment. "Together, then. But understand this. The curse will demand more than courage. It will demand sacrifice, trust, and the strength to look into the darkness and not turn away." The castle trembled suddenly, a low rumble echoing through the halls, shadows elongated and twisted, moving with a life of their own. Figures emerged, dark and shifting, their forms almost human but twisted by the magic that had haunted Kalen's bloodline for generations. The curse was no longer a whisper. It was a storm. Kalen drew his sword, its blade reflecting the moonlight. Alara's hand went to the dagger at her belt, the weapon light but steady in her grip. They stood together, two hearts bound by courage, and the bond forged over days of training, lessons, and growing trust. The first shadow lunged. Kalen moved with the precision of a master, striking and parrying, his movements almost like a dance. Alara followed his lead, using the techniques he had taught her, her heart racing, her senses sharpened. Together, they fought, moving in harmony despite the chaos surrounding them. But the shadows were relentless. They did not tire, did not falter. They seemed to feed on fear, seeking the cracks in courage, the hesitation and trust. Alara felt a moment of panic, but Kalen's voice cut through the roar of battle. "Remember what I taught you. The curse feeds on doubt, not strength." She took a deep breath, steadied her stance, and pushed forward. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering as if unsure of her resolve. Alara realized then that the battle was not just physical, it was about willpower, about confronting the darkness within as well as without. Kalen fought beside her, but she noticed something troubling. Each strike he made seemed to drain him. The scars along his body, glowing faintly, as if the curse itself pulled strength from his life force. She could not bear to watch him suffer silently. The weight of his power and burden evident in every movement. "Kalen!" she shouted over the clash of steel. "You are not alone. I stand with you." His eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment, the storm of fear, pain, and determination softened. He nodded, and in that acknowledgement, something shifted. The shadows faltered, sensing the bond between them, the courage and loyalty that neither fear nor darkness could break. But the curse would not be defeated so easily. From the far end of the hall, a greater shadow emerged, towering and more twisted than the others. Its presence was suffocating, cold, and heavy with centuries of malice. Kalen's jaw tightened, and Alara felt the same instinctive fear that had haunted her since her first days in the castle. "This is it," Kalen said, his voice calm but laced with steel. Alara took a deep breath, stepping forward beside him. She had trained for this, prepared for it, but nothing could have fully readied her for the intensity of the moment. The shadow loomed closer, and she could feel the cold reach into her very bones. Kalen raised his sword, and Alara mirrored him with her dagger. Together, they charged. The shadow lashed at them, dark tendrils snapping like whips, yet they moved as one, a rhythm forged from days of trust, courage, and unspoken connection. Each strike, each parry, each step forward was an assertion. They would not yield. As they fought, Alara remembered the mirror of shadows, the visions she had seen of despair, loss, and ruin. She realized then that the curse thrived on fear and isolation. Its power would break only when confronted by unity, trust, and the courage to face truth without turning away. Kalen fought with every ounce of strength, his movements precise but weary. Alara could see the cost of every blow, the toll it took on him. Desperation and determination mingled in his storm-gray eyes. But so did something new trust. He trusted her to stand, to fight, to hold her own. Alara found herself in the center of the hall, facing tendrils of darkness that sought to pull her down. She took a deep breath and remembered Kalen's words. Courage alone is not enough. Understanding and trust are the rest. She focused on the bond they had forged, on the shared strength, and on the loyalty that had grown between them. With a shout, she lunged, her dagger striking the heart of a shadow that threatened to engulf her. The dark form shivered, flickered, and then dissolved into nothingness. Kalen struck beside her, his sword cutting through the tendrils like sunlight through mist. The larger shadow recoiled, and for a moment, silence fell. The curse had sensed the strength of their bond, the courage that was no longer divided, but united. It hesitated, uncertain, before gathering its final power for one last assault. Kalen turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. Now, Elara. Together. They raised their weapons, hearts beating in unison, and charged. The shadow surged forward, but their unity, courage, and trust were stronger. The combined force of Kalen's mastery and Elara's determination struck true. Light exploded where shadow had threatened to consume them, and with a final cry, the darkness shattered, leaving only silence in its wake. Elara sank to her knees, exhausted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Kalen stood beside her, sword lowered, his chest heaving, eyes fixed on the place where the shadow had fallen. Slowly, he turned to her, and in that gaze, she saw relief, pride, and something she could not yet name. "You did it," he said softly, almost in disbelief. Elara looked up at him, and the weight of the night's battle began to lift. She had faced fear, darkness, and the curse itself. Yet she had survived stronger, braver, and closer to Kalen than ever before. Kalen reached out, placing a hand over hers. The touch was gentle, grounding, and it carried the promise of trust and connection. "You were by my side when I needed it most. And you saved more than the kingdom tonight. You saved me." Her heart beat fast, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the depth of their bond. "We saved each other," she said softly. The night air seemed to shimmer around them, carrying a sense of peace that had been absent for generations. The curse had been broken, or at least held at bay, and for the first time, the castle felt alive with hope instead of shadows. Days after the battle, the kingdom began to heal. Kalen walked the halls with a new calm. The weight of the curse eased, though the scars remained as a reminder of the trials endured. Elara moved beside him not as a frightened bride, but as a partner, a force in her own right, and a heart bound to his in trust and courage. They often walked together in the gardens at twilight, sharing quiet conversations and moments of connection. Kalen, once distant and unreadable, now allowed glimpses of vulnerability and even humor. Elara, once fearful and hesitant, had become confident, strong, and unwavering in her loyalty. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Kalen stopped in the garden and looked at her. "Elara, you have changed everything. Not just the kingdom, not just me, but everything we face together." She smiled softly, feeling the warmth of the moment. "And you've shown me what courage truly is, what it means to stand for something, and for someone." Kalen took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "Then we stand together. Always." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of the forests beyond, and for the first time since her arrival, Elara felt at peace. She had entered this world as a bride bound by duty and debt, but she remained not a prisoner of fate, but a partner in a life shaped by courage, trust, and the beginnings of love. The castle walls, once heavy with shadows, now seemed to hum with quiet strength. The curse was broken, the kingdom safe, and two hearts had found each other amidst scars, shadows, and trials that would have broken lesser souls. And as the stars emerged above the tower, Elara and Kalen stood side by side, ready to face whatever future awaited, together. The storm had passed, but the bond it had forged would last forever.